Hey there, I'm Joshua Bardwell, and I'm going to build a quadcopter for you today. The specific quadcopter I'm building is the AllCarbonRC Coyote. I've got all the parts here. Let me just briefly introduce you to the parts that are going to be on this build. We've got the frame. This is the frame. It comes from the manufacturer, all dressed up like this. Nice and easy with all the parts. Very nice. All the screws and bolts are separated in their own little bags. I always like it when manufacturers do this because if you just get one bag with a pile of screws and nuts in it, it's not always clear which ones are intended to go where. Here, you know that all of these go together in one step of the build. A very nice step that a manufacturer takes to give you a little bit more value. The rest of the gear, a lot of it is from Team Black Sheep. TBS makes very high quality gear. They're partnering with different vendors, and it looks like AllCarbonRC has selected them as their preferred vendor. So here we've got the TBS Unify video transmitter. That's going to be our video transmitter. We've got these TBS BLHeli-S ESCs. Very nice little ESCs. Look at that. It's so tiny. And one nice thing about them is that they come naked, which is how I prefer my ESCs. I like my ESCs like I like my coffee. Black. Wait, no, that's not right. The ESCs... The ESCs come naked, so if you're going to direct solder, you can just direct solder very easily. A lot of ESCs, you get them and you have to desolder the wires. That's the first thing you do. What a waste. So they come naked, but they come with the wires pre-cut, pre-tinned, and ready to go. A very nice additional touch that you would expect from a high-end vendor like TBS. So there's our ESCs. The motors are T-motor F40. This is a hell of a motor. If you want to know more about this motor, go check out miniquadtestbench.com. I don't for sure know that he's tested this exact motor. I bet that he has, though. And the T-motor F40 is a screamer. There is nothing quite like the clickety-clickety cogging feeling you get from these. I love it. It's so, I mean, it doesn't mean it's a good motor, but it's awfully nice. Clickety-clickety-clickety. This is a 2400 kV version of this motor. I am normally a fan of higher kV motors. 2600 kV with a 5x4x3 prop is my favorite, but this motor's no slouch. I'm sure this will be fine. We've got a 1177 style FPV camera. I'm not even going to take it out of the box. And very nice, they've included a GoPro lens, the 2.5 millimeter-ish GoPro lens that I was introduced to by Final Glide, and many people like to fly them. It gives a very nice balance of the narrower field of view of a standard 2.8 millimeter that comes on the camera versus a very wide angle with a little bit of fisheye 2.1 millimeter lens. This is a sort of a very happy medium, very good image quality, etc. I've got videos on why this lens is good, and very nice that a vendor is including it. I hope to see more vendors doing this, including a good quality lens like this in a kit like this. Good choice. The flight controller is the Moto Labs Tempest. Now this is an interesting choice. This is a flight controller with a PDB built in. You can see it's got a section here for direct soldering an XT60 or soldering a pigtail. It's got ESC outputs right here, and etc. But it doesn't have any of the additional fancy bits and bobs that you might expect from a flight controller these days. Many flight controllers these days are including things like an OSD, etc. This is, well, it's not fair to call it bare bones. This is a very good. Moto makes excellent flight controllers, very good quality, but just doesn't want to, sort of throw the kitchen sink into them. So this copter does not include an OSD by default, as near as I can tell. I've been through all the parts. It doesn't seem to have one. So what are we going to do? I'm going to put on this copter one of the last Red Rotor RROSD V1s. The Red Rotor RROSD V2 has come out. I have a video out that talks a little bit more about it, but I've had this sitting around for a long time, and I think this is a fitting way of saying goodbye to the RROSD V1. And as a part of this, I'm going to show you how you combine the Red Rotor RROSD, which has a PDB, with a flight controller or something else that has a PDB built in. For example, some people ask, how do I use an RROSD or anything like it? There's a Holybro one. There it is. Yep, this is the Holybro PDB OSD. It's basically functionally exactly the same as this one, just it's a different OSD, different software, but it's the same. It's a PDB and OSD. How do you combine one of these with a flight controller that also has a PDB and still get everything working right? I'll show you how to wire it up. You see the same thing if you've got an alien. The alien has a PDB and the PDB is integral to it holds the legs on. So how would you use one of these with that? Well, I'll show you. Then finally, we've got the TBS Triumph antennas, and these are one of the best FPV antennas on the market, period. Some people complain a little bit about the durability. They're very durable, but they're a little stiff here, and if you hit them right, they will break at the base. But, everything breaks eventually, so there's nothing is completely unbreakable, and the RF performance of these is really, really insanely good. So that is the kit that we're going to be using. Let's get into the build. We'll start with these two plates. If you look at the plates closely, you'll see that one of them has these extra big holes right here, and those are for the captive nuts. The captive nuts are these things right here, and you'll see that they have a little sort of serrated edge, and that edge is going to go in, and it's going to kind of sink in and grip the carbon, and you just got to kind of squeeze it down in there a little bit. The holes are definitely a little stiff. They're supposed to be stiff because they need to retain the nut. It may be helpful to take something like something flat, like a flathead screwdriver or something, and kind of just push it down in that way. You don't need to get them completely recessed because once you start putting the screws in, they will pull them down into the hole. So they just, I think, need to be retained mostly. Resist the urge to do something like this and squeeze them down in, because the pliers will probably damage they'll at least scratch up the carbon, if not something worse. The 8 captive nuts are installed. Mostly. They're retained anyway. God damn it. The 8 captive nuts are installed. If they're not all completely flush, the screws will pull them tight and the rest of the way into the hole once you insert the screw. There's some question of which of these screws to use here, and it's kind of just a matter of trial and error, isn't it? So that's clearly not right. That's clearly too long. Alright, so what I've done is, for these 4 holes where the flight controller is going to mount, I've used the 16mm screws. And then for these ones, there's only one you can see where it fits just perfectly flush. And as I'm installing these, you can kind of see this captive nut is not completely inserted, but if I just keep screwing, you gotta be careful because you don't want to strip it, but you can just pull it snug like so. Perfect. Something to watch out for is don't install the legs on the wrong holes. So you want the leg to be like this. You don't want to line up like this, you see, and end up with the leg like so. That's not what you want. You want it like so. Okay, so at this point you've got the legs installed. Make sure that they're in the stretched X configuration. In other words, they're a little bit longer this way and narrower this way. And also you should have your screws installed. You should have 4 screws in the middle sticking up by a couple of millimeters, and the screws on the outside should be completely flush. If you don't have that, like if you've accidentally put one slightly long one in here or something like that, go back and dig through your pile and check and make sure it's correct. And now we're going to install the ESC wires. They do come conveniently pre-cut and pre-tinned, so there's going to be one end that's tinned and ready to solder, and one end that is not cut, it's just snipped smooth. We're going to solder this end. I am going to do something really radical. You haven't seen me do this a lot on my channel. I'm going to use some flux on it, and the way that works is you just take the wire and you just dip it ever so slightly into the end there. What they do in the instruction video for this, I'm going to try and follow the instructions, is they stick it through and then they solder it that way. Now normally if I were to do that, I would solder from the back side. So yeah, that's what I'm going to do. Stick it through and then solder from the back side. Soldering iron is at 800 Fahrenheit. There is, if you use flux instead of the rosin core solder, you do get a lot of flux left over here. It's best to clean that with a little bit of alcohol, just some isopropyl alcohol. We'll clean that off. I'm going to continue and do the rest of the wires off camera because soldering on camera is hard. If you don't know how to solder at this point, you're going to screw this up. The worst case scenario is you'll damage the board and you'll need to buy a new one of these. The best case scenario is that you'll finish and think you've done a great job and your copter will have weird problems like dropping out of the sky. I strongly recommend, if you are not very confident in your soldering, that you check into a soldering 101 course. There's a whole lot of people out there who think they're okay at soldering and they're actually really bad at it. And there's some people who think they're really good at soldering and they're really bad at it. But the majority of people who are bad at soldering don't think they're bad at soldering. So if you know you're bad at soldering, stop. Go learn how to solder and then come back. Do not build a quadcopter like this if you know you're bad at soldering. It will just be an exercise in frustration. And if you think you're good at soldering, it still might be worthwhile for you to just make sure. Go find somebody else who's good at soldering and see if they agree. Anyway, I don't know. I'm going to finish soldering this up now. So here I've soldered the ESC wires and I have cleaned the flux off the board using a little isopropyl alcohol. The joints look okay. I would encourage you to double check at this point that you have red on plus and black on minus for all four of them. That is the kind of silly mistake that you'll make, and then you'll blow up an ESC and you won't know why. You won't be happy about that. The official instruction assembly video for this frame shows the wires being inserted from the bottom and soldered from the top. That probably would have been a better way to do it. The wires would come out the bottom and then the top would be a little cleaner, but I'm not going to go back and redo it. It does mean that my ESC wires are going to be getting in the way of this header when I'm trying to work on it, and that's too bad, but not bad enough to make me go back and resolder all these wires. The official assembly video for the AllCarbonRC Coyote does not show a ground wire being installed for the ESCs. If at all possible, I prefer to install a ground wire for the ESCs. Some people you can get away with not installing the signal ground every time. Some builds you can get away with it, but it's cheap insurance against bad things happening to install it, and I always install it if I can. If we look at these ESCs up close, we can see that there is a signal and ground. You see the little minus sign there? So there's a signal and ground for that, and then here is the ground for the main power and positive for the main power. So there is a pad for signal ground, and I am going to use it. I've gone ahead and printed out the pinout diagram for the Tempest, and I see what the pattern is now for the motor outputs. Numbers 1 and 4 are on the outside of the board, with the ground being the next one. Numbers 2 and 3 will have the ground on the outside and the signal wire is the next one in. So that there is a pattern there. But I'm just going to refer to this when I solder up the wires to make sure that I get them correct. So now all the signal wires are installed as well. And again, this is a good time to go back to your pinout diagram and double check that you haven't made any mistakes. The professional thing to do now would be to cover these with, well, you can use liquid electrical tape is a good thing to use to protect these joints. That can protect you if, for example, the copter lands in some tall grass and after it's been raining, maybe get some moisture in here and maybe creates a short. I do not happen to have any liquid electrical tape at the moment, so I won't be doing that, but I should. Now this is the point where I would install the flight controller on the frame if I were doing a standard install, but I'm not going to do that because I'm also going to install the RROSD. The key thing about the RROSD is that the current sensor has to work. And in order for the current sensor to work, you have to have current come in the battery leads and out the ESC pads. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to install the main battery leads here, and then I'm going to install the jumper wire from the ESC to the battery leads on the Tempest. And that means that current will flow into the ROSD through its current sensor and out the ESC pads, and then into the Tempest's main battery pads, just like it expects. And this is the technique that you would use if you were going to install the ROSD or any other similar PDB and OSD on a board that already had an integrated OSD of some kind, like an Alien, for example, or well, anything else. So now I'm going to go ahead and install the battery lead on the ROSD. I've got a battery lead here. It's already made up. This is 12 gauge wire. I prefer to use 14 gauge. I just happen to have a 12 gauge one ready to go. 12 gauge is better from a perspective of electrical resistance, but 14 gauge is way easier to work with. On many of these devices, you just would not be able to even get a 12 gauge to go onto the pads. But the ROSD has pretty roomy pads. You can see it's not going to go down in that hole, that's for sure. But I can make it work. I've done this before. And I will also say I've got my soldering iron at 850, which is, it needs to be good and hot for these big 12 gauge wires for sure. I'm just going to tin this to begin with. Get a little blob of solder built up there. Okay, got a good start there. And these are pre-tinned, but a little more extra solder never hurt, I don't think. Let's make sure we get some fresh solder and some flux on there. And then you notice when the wire gets hot, the wire starts to melt the solder. Now the wire is melting the solder, not the soldering iron. A little extra there. A little drip on the table too. No big deal. Ooh, that's still hot. That's still liquid. Oh yeah, there we go. Now it's not liquid anymore. Ooh, ow, yes it is. Oh, I found a hot spot. Now for you soldering purists out there, look, I'm using flux. I'm using flux. I don't normally use flux. I just use rosin core solder. But every time I don't use flux, people are like, you should use flux. So now I'm using flux just to make you happy. Are you happy? Who cares? I'm just going to set that down on top here and press down on it. And that's what the joints look like when they're done. Cue the solder brigade telling me why it's terrible, but there you go. That's the best I can do, and I think it'll be good enough for my purposes. I like to just use a little ratchet head, a little socket here to do that. Just give you a little bit more leverage. And is a 7/32 socket. I just keep it sitting around on my desk. Now let's think about how we're going to do this. I'm going to identify the front-facing arrow on this board. The front-facing arrow is like so, and it's unfortunate because this is on the wrong side from this. This needs to get over to here. That's too bad. It'd be nice if the board mounted like this. We could just jump her up, and that'd be a piece of cake. But the hassle of turning the board around is not at all worth the trouble. We got no contact there, so these standoffs are going to be okay. That's good. No nothing there. Yep, that's good. That's going to be fine. So we just got to run like a wire over. It's also a dang shame this is going to be in the way of the USB. I almost wonder if it makes sense to turn the ROSD. The ROSD has no particular orientation, but it is nice to have this cable coming out the back. So fine. Well, I'll just figure it out. What I think I want to do is just take the wire and lay them across like this, and then sandwich on top. 12 gauge wire is going to be too thick to let the board come down on top, but I think with a little rubber O-ring, we should be just fine with this 14 gauge wire, and I feel like 14 gauge is acceptable for the amount of current we're drawing. When you're soldering, you want the piece to be hot and to melt the solder. You don't want the soldering iron to be melting the solder. So you can see I'm heating the wire until it becomes hot enough to melt the solder. And then I'm letting the wire soak up the solder. I'm not dabbing this. The mistake people make is to dab the solder onto the soldering iron. That's not your goal. Your goal is to touch the workpiece to the soldering iron such that the workpiece becomes hot, and then the workpiece absorbs the solder by melting it into itself. If the workpiece is not hot enough to absorb the solder, then you're not doing it right. It does help to have a little bit of solder on the tip of the iron to help make surface contact and transfer heat into the workpiece. But the goal should be to get the workpiece hot enough to melt the solder. Both sides. I'm using this really honking big solder, so it's leaving big blobs of solder on the bottom of my iron. So be it. I could come underneath, and then I wouldn't have any wire in between the flight controller. Oh, yeah. That's the way to do it. That's the way to do it, for sure. So, I'm not going to do this. Let's just clean that up. That's the way to do it. Oh, yeah. Now, I'm just going to put the ROSD back on here, the standoffs, just as a convenient way of holding it in place while I work with it. I'm not going to leave it there. Okay. Now I'm gonna tin these pads on the underside. For this kind of joint, I kind of want to build up a little blob to work with. Ouch. Let's not burn my hand this time. Oh, that's a good one. Look at that. Look how nicely that flowed. Oh, there we go. Oh, yeah, I like that a lot. Now, we'll turn this over. Just double check our clearance on the bottom. Looks good. No chance of shorting to the carbon. We're all good. Again, if I were doing this correctly, I would put some liquid electrical tape on here. You can also use conformal coating after you're done. Either of those is good. I am not doing that because I like to live dangerously. Don't be like me. Now, the temptation here would be to put this real snug, but you gotta leave yourself room to work with. You can't make the wires so snug that you can't get the stuff apart. Like, for example, we want to be able to lift this off to work on it for some reason. So let's not do it super snug. Let's leave ourselves a little bit of slack. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring these over the top. 14 gauge actually will go in the holes. It could come up from underneath and go into the hole, but I'm worried if we give it enough slack to really make that happen. Yeah, okay. It's going to be a tight one, but I'm going to see what I can do. Just going to eyeball the length here. I'm going to try and cut it a little long, because if I cut it short, I can't go back and make it longer. It is. I think it is. Oh yeah, that'll do okay. I might cut that a little shorter, but I'm going to push my luck here. that's what we've got there. I may go back and snip those a little bit with the snips and just clean them up, but I might not. I don't know. But you can see what we've got now. We've got the main battery lead going into the ROSD, and then the ESC pads of the ROSD going to the input of the flight controller. And that means that the current sensor on the ROSD will still see every single bit of current that the whole system pulls. Then the ESCs are wired here to the Tempest, and then we go from there out to the ESCs. Now you might ask, why didn't I just wire the ESCs up to the ROSD? What was the point of wiring the ESCs up to the Tempest? Well, I kind of wanted to demonstrate the point, of course. If the Tempest has a current sensor built in, which I don't think it does because I don't see a shunt resistor, but if this device had a current sensor built in, it would also be perceiving accurate current, so we would preserve that. Also, it's a little nicer with the ESC wires, especially because we don't have extra long wires to get all the way back to these pads on the ROSD. We may not actually have been able to do that very easily, whereas now we absolutely can get to the four corners here of the Tempest. So it's just a demonstration of the point. We certainly could have wired the ESCs up to a PDB instead of wiring them to the Tempest, but since the Tempest is how this build is supposed to go, I figured it'd be nice to do it that way. And yes, you can, oh yes, just barely, you can get that off there to work on it if you so desire. Now we're going to install the ESCs. Because we've raised up the stack just a little bit, the ESCs aren't going to go in exactly the same place on the arm. They're going to have to come in a little bit to make room for this wire. Also, make sure you give yourself a little slack on the wire. Don't pull the wire taut like this and then solder the ESC up. Make sure that you're going to give yourself enough room if you build it like I do, like with the ROSD, which you're probably not. But I'm going to make sure that I give myself enough room here to get these wires down. There's no harm having the ESCs there. Yeah. What I like to do with ESCs is just get a length of double-sided foam tape and stick it to the bottom of the ESC and use that to hold the ESC in place while I solder it. I also think that this is good practice even if you don't need to hold the ESC in place, because I think the foam tape gives a little bit of padding and helps protect the ESC from vibrations and so forth. Alrighty, the ESCs are installed. I will say I had a little bit of trouble getting the ground wires to stick. I even had trouble tinning the pad. I don't know why that would be. I used a little extra flux on the pad. I normally do not have to do that. My iron was hot. I even took it up to 850, and just the solder would not flow onto the pad. A little bit of flux did the trick, I guess, but it was a little surprising that happened, and so be it. So now I guess it's time to do the motors. And fortunately the motors have enough wire to get onto these ESCs, even though I've shortened up the ESCs a little. I'm almost tempted to do something a little radical with the motors, and that is, no, I'm going to cut them short. So I'm going to install the motors on the arms. With the motors installed now, the screws are all inserted, and I'm going to tin the pads and solder the wires up. With a brushless motor like we're using here, the direction that it spins is determined by the order the wires go onto the ESC, and there's no way to predict, unless you've worked with this exact ESC and this exact motor before, whether straight will cause clockwise or counterclockwise motion. The ESC can actually make the motor spin either direction. It doesn't really matter. It's just how the software in the ESC is configured. If you need to reverse the direction of a brushless motor, all you have to do is swap any two wires with each other on the ESC. But there's no way to predict really which way the motor is going to be going unless you've done this before. So one way to do this is to wire the ESCs up, two of them with a wire crossed and two of them straight, and then that will mean that two of the ESCs will be clockwise and two will be counterclockwise, and then you just figure out which they are and solder them in the right location. I find that to be kind of tedious, and I just wire all my ESCs straight through with no wires crossed. I'll just go 1, 2, 3 to the ESC pads, And then in software, in BL Heli Suite, since these are BL Heli ESCs, I will reverse the ones that need to be reversed after the copter is built. I've heard some rumors from some people that they don't like to do that because it causes the copter to crash, drop out of the sky. There are only there's like 2 ESC models that have a bug where if you use motor reversing in software, you can get desyncs and the copter can drop. I think they're DYS ESCs. I'm not 100% sure. I know at least one of them is a DYS ESC. In general, though, motor reversing is fine to use, and it's my preferred way of approaching a build like this, because I don't like having to deal with figuring out beforehand which motors are going to rotate which direction. I am going to try and give myself a little bit of slack here. You can also use the technique where you come back, you fold back like this, and that actually lets you keep all of the wire. I'm not going to do that because I don't think it's very neat, but I'm going to try and give myself a little bit of slack on the wire so that if I need a little more wire, I can have it. And that's going to bring us to the end of this video. There'll be one more, I think, in this build series. I'm letting them go a little bit long this time instead of splitting them up into smaller chunks. Enjoy it. We'll see how this build finishes up. We'll see the one big mistake that I made that I haven't told you about yet, and how I fixed it in the next video. Thanks for watching. Happy flying.